welcome. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Jenn Corbitt tāku ingoa. As Tara said, I'm one of the coordinators of the Science Teaching Leadership Program, which is a program that Royal Society Te Apārangi manages for the government. But before we start, I'm going to get each person just to say a little bit about themselves and a wee bit about their context in terms of teaching and where they work currently. Okay? You want to start, Teri?
Kia ora everybody. My name's Teri Finn and I'm a teacher. I have taught for quite a number of years up at Onslow College, up the hill here in Johnsonville, large co-educational college with a stunning team of teachers. And I miss it sorely because at the moment, this year, I have been seconded to the Ministry of Education because, as you may be aware, we have quite a number of reviews underway in the area of education with this huge work plan the Minister has implemented, and one of those is the NCEA review, and that is one of my key projects at the moment. So I've been involved in the early stages of that. I miss the classroom, but I think that for me, right at the moment, this is the right place for me to be. And a lot of people have been coming to me and saying, "Oh, are you enjoying your life at the ministry? It must be lovely to be out of the classroom." And I say, it's a whole heap harder than being in the classroom. It's a real challenge for me. But this is a great opportunity to have a conversation about what's really dear to my heart. So thank you very much. Thanks.
Ken.
Thank you. Whenever we actually introduce ourselves, we always say that we're teachers first up, and I think that's one of the things that happens with teachers is that we get that's what we do. So I'm a teacher, head teacher science at Casula High School in Sydney, and I'm also a grandfather. So that takes up a bit of time now too. But I've been teaching since 1988, so it's been quite a few years, and you can probably guess how old I am now. But we'll talk more about the other things later. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Sarah Johns tōku ingoa. I have been a teacher now for, this is my 20th year. I'm a mother first actually, and have two beautiful girls. I work at Nelson College for Girls, but I haven't always worked there. I've been there 10 years now. So I've worked as a teacher here in New Zealand, started in Katikati College up in the Bay of Plenty, and have moved around the country. And for the last 20 years, I have to say, I've enjoyed every minute of it. I've enjoyed the challenges that go with being an educator, and have enjoyed some fantastic opportunities that have come with this career as well. So I look forward to sharing my thoughts with you throughout this session.
Excellent, thank you. That's great. So we thought the first theme that would be of interest to you is to think about what the purpose of science education is. I mean, we're all actively involved in it in different ways, but have we actually paused to think about it? So what we're going to think about is the purpose of science education in the 21st century. And what we want, I would like the three guests to think about, is that has your definition of the purpose changed over time? And is it different for different groups of students? Okay? So who's going to start?
Oh, look, I'll jump in first.
Oh, good one, Ken.
Look, I'd say it's definitely changed. And from my perspective, it's probably just because I've got older and having kids myself. But when I first started teaching, the idea was that if you engaged students, that was the big buzzword, then that's what teaching was all about. But teaching is really about making sure that students can do those fundamental things like read, to write, and do mathematics. So even though I'm a science teacher, I'm a teacher, so teachers have to do that. We've got to make sure that students have got those basic skills. When we talk about science and why we need students to learn science, well, the way the Earth is changing, with things with climate change and all these things, if we don't have people engaged in science, then it's going to be a pretty bad world. And if you consider the fact that we're eventually going to have problems with our food supply, the world's getting bigger, our population's getting bigger, we need the money to be able to afford that. So Australia, of technology in 2013, we actually had $67 billion that came into the country because of it. So from a country's perspective, you need to actually have an income from data. So if we don't do it, we're going to lose. The other thing which I try to promote is actually girls in STEM, because if we don't have girls getting involved in science, technology, engineering and maths, in those subject areas, then, well, first of all, the career path is going to be lost. And on top of that, we lose half of our brains and the creativity that won't go into those jobs. So we actually definitely need it.
Okay, I'll chip in there and just take your gender comments at the end there. I have to agree that we need to make sure that access and involvement in science is equitable between genders and between every other minority or diversity category. Not only because of the economic impact that would involve, but because there are different ways of interacting in a science way with our world. So I think you're right. We have a capacity issue that is important, but we also have a diversity of views issue and a diversity of the ways in which people think and interact in science. And if we go back to, the 21st century science, and is that a different sort of science? There's part of me that says it's not, because really, if you think about what science teaching, science education is all about, science is a way of interacting with the world. It's a way of noticing and responding to what's going on in your world. And that isn't going to change. The importance of noticing and being able to interrogate what you observe, whether that's data or simply observations, it's the way to interrogate your thoughts and your ideas and your theories about the world. So I don't think that part of it has changed. I think the issues have changed. The issues are coming at us faster, but the tools that we have to deal with them are also developing. So we may have a different set of tools and a different set of applications, but the science itself and the teaching of the science, I think, has got a real core to it that hasn't changed.
I guess my thinking about science education has evolved over those 20 years. And I guess when I first started, I very much centred my practice around what I was exposed to as a student. And then as I've grown in my understanding for science education and its role in kids' lives in terms of deep learning and the dispositions and the character and the way of being and humanising the education experience so they see the relevance in their own lives, for me, has become really, really important. I feel like, science education has a real opportunity to enhance equity in our learners and in their place in the world. I think when I first started as a teacher, I was really, sort of heightened as to how I could get students to pick science as they move into the senior school, and that was the measure of me in terms of how successful I was as an educator. But now my focus very much is on how do I create conditions or experiences where students connect to their learning emotionally and academically and cognitively, so that they're actually relishing their role in it. And then from there, regardless of where their pathway takes them, that they come out as very capable thinkers and learners. So that's how it's evolved for me. And
So in terms, there's a couple of things that came up there that's of interest, is the notion of engagement and what that is and what it looks like. And I think also I want you to think about first of all what you believe engagement looks like if students are engaged. And the second thing is, does every child have to be a scientist?
Can I jump in there? I think every child is born a scientist, and I think that much of what we do to them and much of what they're exposed to beats it out of them. So I think it's on us as teachers to to nourish that natural curiosity that young people have. I worry, I'm sure generations of parents have worried, about the paucity of experience of some of our young people, that I believe the ability to engage in a science literate way relies on you having a range of experiences, of having got down and dirty with nature at some point, and having transferred that ability to actually step out and feel and touch and experience things in the natural world. That's what you're going to build your science thinking on at a later stage, because if you haven't got those experiences, then you're simply going to be fed this diet of potted experience, which is not the same thing at all and doesn't lead to the same degree of scientific thinking. That's where I have some concerns today with the engagement of young people with devices, continually device fed, so that they're being stimulated, but different, or the same part of the brain is being stimulated all the time, and that's a different experience of the world when it's not first-hand. So how did I get there? We're talking, engagement, thank you.
And everyone being a scientist.
Yeah, so everyone is a scientist, naturally, and we need to tap into those real experiences in order to continue that engagement. Yeah.
Look, if I talk about engagement, who's bought a car? Probably a few of us have bought a car at one stage. Okay. When you go to buy a car, you actually like to buy the car. You don't like to be sold the car. Okay. You don't want someone there to say no. You want a red car, but you don't want the salesperson to say, no, look, you don't want a red car. You want a white car. Okay. The same thing with kids. Kids want to be engaged, and they want to be in control of their learning. They actually want to know that they've learnt something, and kids love to learn. So if they're given the opportunity to actually do a science experiment or design and make activity, one of the things that we fall into the trap of with science is we try to have the correct answer, but if we can get students to actually find their own answers and their own stories, then it sticks into their head, and they get engaged. We find that some kids that are very artistic, that love to do videos, they think that they're actually making a video, but actually what they're doing is they're researching, and they're doing all those things like teamwork and collaborating. And the world's getting smaller, I think, when it comes to collaboration. We were actually able to talk face-to-face by Skype.
Yeah.
But I remember when I was really young, my next-door neighbour had all of the neighbours into his house at 4 o'clock in the morning to hear him talk to his daughter who was over in the UK.
Yeah.
So look, we can do lots of stuff now with technology, and I think sometimes we're still teaching back in the 1960s. So if we can get kids to be engaged, use the technology they normally use, then it's a good process.
For me, this engagement, or are we scientists? It's innate. You see what the kids have achieved before they even get to us. Learn to walk, learn to talk. Despite their varied experiences, they're amazing learning machines. And so, for me, I guess when I think about engagement, when you do a crossword, and it's hard and it's tricky, and you've got that feeling where you're a bit fizzy and you're excited and you're wanting to get the answer to it, and you'll ask someone or you'll think about it. Like, when I think of engagement, what it looks like and feels like, that's what I would expect my students to be showing or experiencing for themselves. And the dialogue that I share with them is about challenging and prompting and really seeing if I can push them or challenge them in a way that means that they're engaged and they feel emotionally driven by that. So I guess, how do I create the conditions that lend themselves to students experiencing that level of engagement, that demand? Yeah.
That's great. I'm just thinking that, you know, as well as engagement, and we're talking about students developing skills, dispositions, ways of being, thinking like scientists. There's lots of other words that we see around at the moment. We see things like active participants, we see citizens, we see critically informed, words like that. We talk about authentic, meaningful, relevant contexts for learning. There's lots and lots of stuff that probably at a high level we go, oh yeah, that feels absolutely correct. What I want you to tell us is that how do you actually make that happen? How do you make that happen in reality in your everyday life as teachers?
I think the idea about young people seeing themselves as scientists, while I think we had one of the themes was, does everybody have to be a scientist? No, I don't think everybody has to be a scientist, but everyone needs to be able to think scientifically, to engage with what comes from the world of science. And so we need to, if you like, give them some spectacles through which to see the world from a science perspective and to be able to sift out what is real and what is not, all the time holding on to this idea that science is tentative. And I think too often in the past, science has been held up as the truth. This is the truth that you need to believe, and it's been presented to us, to our generation, as certainty, and I think that's done us a huge disservice. So in science teaching, I think it's really important for young people to understand and to grasp the tentative nature of science. To do that, they need to have interacted with scientists who present that, who model. This is what we're thinking at the moment. Here's our evidence. What do you think about our evidence? And being able to do that sifting and sorting. Because so much of what we see on the media is so poorly communicated. I'll put New Zealand aside. We have a fantastic science media centre, and that's a really good place for us to go for learning resources, because it is given in a tentative nature. It's given as the latest thinking is. But so much of what they see from their devices, from overseas, is very poorly communicated, dogmatic science, and I think that does us a huge disservice. So as far as teaching science is concerned, it's about the process of developing ideas and the way in which we develop our confidence in those ideas by using the tools of science. I'm not sure if that answered our theme, but that's kind of where my thinking's going. That tentative nature is vital.
Tentative. So rather than going in a line all the time, let's mix it up. Sarah, tell us about a time, Sarah, when you actually think you did what you believe you should be doing.
An example of that is, I guess, when my kids engage in a passion project and they giving birth to an idea is probably the hardest part. And sitting back and watching them sort of think about what's important to them, think about their prior knowledge, their life, their interests, their aspirations, what mum said, what dad said, what they think. And then from there, they start to develop, an investigation that they'd like to pursue, or a piece of technology that they'd like to develop in response to that. And what they need in order to develop that idea in terms of knowledge. What skills do they have that they can employ and leverage off, but what skills do they not have that they either need to develop or they need to seek someone with more experience than them to engage with, to then use that to pursue their idea. For me to sit back and watch them struggle a little bit and not be, very keen to give them the answer or to help them out a little bit, but to be there to provide those questioning, sounding board to sort of think, well, where to next? Or what do you think about that? Have you thought about this? To honour the process of science that allows them to have that journey and not a quick, from A to B, and because I've intervened and given them the answer. So to honour that process, it sometimes can be 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 12 weeks where they've developed their idea, they're off-site interviewing someone, they've invited an expert in, they have the metacognition that goes with, so what do I need to do? What next? How am I going? And for me, as an educator, I feel like it's a really fine balance between ensuring that they have, the dispositional support, the skills support, the knowledge support, the networking support, the working together as teams or flying solo. So when I've seen what kids have produced, and I think, imagine if I had insulted their intelligence by not giving them this opportunity, then that human-powered handlebar for their mountain bike light would never have come from this place. And the richness is very much in that process. Or the kids that wanted to build an emergency shelter out of recycled plastic bags that could be rolled up and put under their desk in case there was an earthquake, and the trial and error that went with that, and at times seeing where students possibly would have given up. And they did put down their tools for a bit, but then my job was to come along and be that coach. So where to next? What's the problem? What do you think? And for me, that's a very rich experience, and that, for me, is the true essence of science education, when they've taken knowledge to build new knowledge. Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
I'm really curious to know where you go to get that expert help for those diverse students working on different projects at the same time. I know we have some great places in New Zealand, but where do you go? You live in Nelson.
The marine electrician up the road, Plante Cosmetics, Cawthron Institute Science.
So you're tapping into your community science.
Absolutely. And sometimes that's via Skype, sometimes that's up the road. They use the phone that's sitting there, and they have to think about what it is what knowledge do they have, what questions do I want to ask, how is that going to then be used. So all of those rich examples of communicating that level. Did you want to add something to that, Ken?
Yeah, look, when we were saying about it, where do you go? Kids like to do real science. Okay, if you get the kids to have a Bunsen burner, put the water on there and find out the boiling point of the water, well, okay, that's a bit boring. But if they do real science and actually go outside of the classroom, collect their data, and then use that data to actually write a report that gets published or gets given to someone, then they feel really, really good. Now, I'm going to put Ashley on the spot. Ashley, who's been terrific for pushing me around from place to place. The name of the program that we spoke to, it was Victoria. Curious Minds, thank you. Curious Minds, which is in New Zealand, is people are nodding their heads, so you all know about it. Okay. It's absolutely awesome because kids get to do real science. And so I won't talk about it. Everyone's nodding their head,
We're all going like this.
Great.
Yes, absolutely. So it's part of the government's initiative for science and
we
society.
try and do the same thing with Water Watch and collecting data about the environment. So it's good.
Absolutely. So you're talking about contextualising science in real sort of authentic situations where kids feel that they've got a relevant voice, that the communities feel that they can sort of add to issues and actually feel like that they're part of making a solution going forward. What is the place, I'm just aware of time, and I know we could be here for a while, but what is the place of how do you balance content knowledge, teaching content knowledge, the things you need to make sense of the science, and the ways you've been describing, which is being a scientist and thinking like a scientist, which is about attitudes and dispositions and ways of being, about, you've told, tentativeness, about trial and error, about not necessarily knowing the right answer. How do you manage that tension, or is it a tension, first of all? How do you manage that, given that you've got the kids for a finite period of time in a secondary school, and there's lots of other pressures on you for them to be coming out the other end prepared and ready for whatever? How do you manage that?
This might actually be really topical. One of the things that, for Australia or New South Wales, we've got the high school certificate. So that's the final exam that a student does. Now, schools are judged by how good your students go in that exam. And students are judged by how good they go in that exam. Now, there's that pressure of the exam. So it's assessment really drives a lot of things that go on in school. The one thing is when we look at our syllabus and the curriculum documents, We have to teach skills and attitudes, but it's really difficult in a written test to actually do that. So quite often what the kids end up feeling they want is the content. They want that knowledge so that they can go well in the test. And it is true, kids need to have the content to do things. Okay, so there is a big place for content. But there's also a big place in making sure that kids can read, write and do the mathematics. And then all of the 21st century skills that we talk about, mind you, we're 18 years into the 21st century, so we're starting to get a little bit behind in that. But all those skills like collaboration, we don't assess it. So that's one of the problems with assessment.
I totally agree with you, and in many ways I do. The academic knowledge, if you want to call it that, the disciplinary knowledge has got to come through. Because, I mean, what is science? If you think about it, science is a body of knowledge as well as a way of thinking. And that's why it has branched out into physics and chemistry and biology and earth science, because each of those disciplines, if you like, has developed and accumulated specific identifiable bodies of knowledge. We cannot disregard those. Otherwise, all the young people end up doing is spinning around in their own immediate experience, and they call it me search. This is this catchphrase, and you can see how that could very easily happen if all they ever do is sit in their beanbag and think, what would I like to investigate? Our challenge as teachers is to give them broad enough experiences and to have them interact enough with real live science and scientists to allow them to hook them in to exploring those deep bodies of disciplinary knowledge that they are then going to be able to use to think with. So I see this knowledge, this disciplinary knowledge that is our science stuff, if you like, our content, as being like a jewel box, if you like. This is our wealth. And the way in which we do it, the nature of science, which is what our curriculum calls it, and the experience and the socio-scientific, cultural, the doing, the experiential stuff, they're complementary. If we just spin our wheels doing experiential stuff all the time, you're not going to emerge with science literate citizens at all, because they're not going to have either the cognitive pathways to think properly or the stuff to think with. So I'm really convinced that it's a double thing. And if we're going to get into this project-based learning, we're going to need to think how we help those young people identify what it is they need to know, because they don't know what they don't know. And so they don't necessarily know, as you say, what expert knowledge they're going to need to explore this particular area. And so Reese will attest to this. When you give students the opportunity to do a rich project, they will often pick a topic that is just totally unfeasible for them, because they don't have either the maturity or the resources or the ability to work in that space, and you're often finding yourself bringing it down into a digestible, stepwise investigative process. And that's a juggling act that teachers do, and it's a really hard juggling act to try and steer them in a direction that is appropriate, age-appropriate for them to develop a healthy thirst for that knowledge that they're going to need to do the science. Sarah?
I guess the only thing I really want to add to both what's been said is, I guess I'm always thinking with the kids about what the purpose of knowledge is. So I use knowledge to make sense of my project or of the world. I think about how that knowledge came to be, and in its richest form. So how did that knowledge come about? What process lent itself to building that knowledge? How can you use knowledge to build new knowledge? So for me, it's about, what is the functionality, what is the necessity for knowledge, and where does it come from, as opposed to learn that off by heart and you'll do really good in the test. For me, that's a very shallow view of learning stuff off by heart. Yeah, so
if we're talking about knowledge, what knowledge are we talking about? Are we talking about Western science thinking, or how are you as teachers thinking about the range of science knowledges that students bring, Indigenous perspectives? How do you manage the range of knowledges that sometimes can be connected and seem to be going in the same direction, but sometimes can provide an alternative explanation that can appear to be in tension or in conflict with another bit of knowledge? How do you manage that?
I guess that's part of my mandate as an educator, is to not have to own all the knowledge, to create space and place for kids who are culturally centred in who they are in your room, to bring that prior knowledge, the knowledge of their whānau, their whakapapa, their wānanga, to bring it to the table and have opportunities to incorporate that, to provide a window into the knowledge that exists for them. So once again, I keep saying it's up to me to create those conditions of how I create and value relationships in that room, relationships for learning. I don't have to own or have that knowledge in order to make it accessible. It's creating that space and that place for kids to bring it.
Look, I think there's also a good opportunity to actually look at. I mean, when you said about Western science, it's one of the things that we teach from the textbook, which is written, and that's the knowledge part. But there's so many extra things that we're starting to find out. Aboriginal culture in Australia, for example, they didn't do too much when it came. Well, they did look at the stars, but their thinking was actually looking at the dark areas of the sky, not the bright areas. Totally different to what we do, but that's the way which they actually did their navigation. And you hear stories about the people that actually came to New Zealand and being able to actually go by canoe from place to place. I mean, you needed to be able to navigate. You needed to actually have maps. These are the things that we've got to actually make sure that we ensure that our kids know about.
Yeah, the stories of science, stories of how science was built, and especially the stories of the mistakes that were made and the misconceptions that stuck around for so long. They're the really valuable ones that build into that profoundly sensible tentativeness that science has. And I think if we only ever tell the stories of science, of the great eureka moments and of the dogmas that have persisted, then we perpetuate that myth that science is a certainty, and that's so useless to us. We can't use that. Yeah, stories are great. The nature of science, the histories.
Okay, I'm just, before we finish and hand it over to the floor to ask you lots of questions, I can see they're writing down things. Let's think about STEM and STEAM and whatever else we've got. There's lots of talk, and certainly I was at a conference in Christchurch, as were Teri and Ken, and there was lots of conversation about making those connections between learning areas to try and make science relevant and connected and show that it's a complexity that is not, the world doesn't operate in little boxes. So I suppose what I'm interested in is how do you maintain the integrity of the learning areas within a model that talks about togetherness and connectedness? So rather than tell us about STEAM examples, I want you to think a wee bit more about how do you maintain the integrity, and in particular thinking about science. Who wants to have that one? Ken, is that you? Do you think you want to start that one?
Look, my mind's trying to tick over. Look, there's STEM is a big buzzword at the moment.
Absolutely.
Every week in Australia there's somebody talking about STEM. We've just actually had our federal Minister for Education talking about why we need to have extra places for STEM at university and better qualified teachers, which is terrific. But sometimes when schools will talk about STEM, they will talk about their science teacher doing this and their maths teacher doing this and their engineering or TAS teachers, design and technology teachers, doing this component. One of the things that I like with STEM is that we actually start to get the idea of teachers teaching right across the board. Mm-hmm. And we had can I talk about a project?
You can. Okay. You can talk about a project.
I was making, for our topic on simple machines, we were actually making, out of cardboard, trebuchets. And then our woodwork teacher at the end of the year said he had some spare time, so he had some students that were actually making wooden trebuchets. Very accurate, about this size, able to fire golf balls. Perfect. My kids no longer needed the swing set at home, so I took that to school, and a big project the kids just loved. We made this super big trebuchet that we could fire shot put balls, and the amount of enthusiasm that got behind that was absolutely awesome.
Excellent.
STEM is, you're right, it's somewhat contrived, isn't it? Because really, when you do hands-on science, you are doing STEM. So it is a bit of a catchphrase. I think it's done us, the STEM movement has done us a service because it has challenged us to get out of our silo and to start to name the mathematics and the engineering and the technology that is inherent in science. And I think the more we interact with scientists, you'd be hard pressed to actually find someone who would claim to be just doing science without doing the other aspects of STEM, or STEAM in many cases, as well. So I think the value of, if you like, the STEM movement is simply to highlight those connections. And I think in New Zealand with our education, we are at an exciting stage. There are some interesting opportunities opening up for us to explore that cross-curricular teaching, and it may not just be STEM. You're probably bringing in H's for history and C's for classics as well into our teaching projects, so that we're celebrating and recognising the different lenses that we can put on a particular piece of learning. And our challenge, of course, is going to be next: how do you assess that? How do you get the and I think if we can just go to assessment for a moment, I see assessment being absolutely integral to all of our teaching and learning, but assessment in different ways. Assessment for learning, which is, as a teacher, you're feeding back to the student what they're learning and what their objectives are and how successful they are, and the student being able to self-assess and figure out what their goal is and how far they have to get there and what steps they will need. So I keep that assessment quite separate from the assessment for credentialing, which is the beast that has completely hijacked our education system. So we need to be really clear that assessment's not a dirty word. Assessment is an integral part of teaching and learning from both parts, and we need to get our credentialing assessment really clearly where it needs to be, valid and credible and incorporated in our learning by all means, because the evidence should be naturally occurring. But that's a big ask, and at the moment in New Zealand, that's our big challenge. Yeah. So I'm going to park that one over there because it's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about the teaching and learning of science. Yeah. And as far as STEM's concerned, I think we need to be integrating our assessment for learning across all of those different disciplines, with both the students and the learners being able to celebrate and recognise that they are using maths in their science, that they are using engineering in their science, and that they are different but overlapping bodies of skills and attitudes and knowledge. Yeah.
Sarah?
And just quickly, so when I think about the projects that the students will engage in at various levels within my teaching, and if I was to go back retrospectively, you could pull out your letters of STEAM and various others. And I guess my question to myself is, how explicit have I been in the interdisciplinary nature of what they've just done, or did it happen in a way that felt natural and they engaged in a way? So I guess I'm thinking that direction, and that's still a question that I have to myself. And then the other one is, if I was a teacher and I wanted to engage in STEM going forward, what planning would I have to put in place? What capability would I have to build in myself in order to pull it off? So, it's do I plan for it? Yeah. In which case it starts to feel quite clumsy in a way, or contrived. Yeah. Or do I let it happen and then think about knowing that I need to navigate that as my role as the educator, and then have clear understanding about what I'm trying to develop with my students? Maybe they don't need to know about it. Maybe it's up to me to guide that process, and then it happens. Or do I want them to be very cognitively present in those processes so that they can evolve and develop and progress, which is something that they could assess in themselves as to how well they progressed within that.
And I think for me as a teacher, at this ripe old age, many of those disciplines within the STEM are not my expertise. So in a way, it's a really good opportunity to model the teacher as learner. That, I don't know how this blimmin' Google Doc works. You're going to have to find someone who can master that and bring that to our learning. So yeah, you're right. It's
Yep. One of the things that this is actually good because we're actually modelling the right thing. One of the things when we talk about STEM and we talk about STEM subjects, okay, they're two separate ways of talking. So STEM is, when we talk about STEM just by itself, we talk about integrating science, technology, engineering and maths. If we talk about the STEM subjects, then we're talking about that we should be promoting science and technology and engineering and maths. So unfortunately, sometimes when it gets into the press, they combine those into the same sentence, which just doesn't make sense.
No, it's sort of like a new thing.
Yeah.
Yes, and if we pick it up as a new learning area, we run the risk of smudging the boundaries and losing all the value of each of them. And so we have this sort of quasi-fluffy throwaway thing called STEM.
It's very much like if we were to talk about creative art. If we were to have a creative arts festival, then we would have artwork, we would have kids singing, we'd have bands playing, pottery displays, but we call that creative arts. So we don't call it creative arts, we call it STEM.
Absolutely. Right, okay, I'm going to hand it over to the floor now. Questions, comments for our panel? If you could just tell us who you are.
Kia ora. Sorry, excuse me. My name's Catherine Simons. I teach at Newlands College. I've just got a question for you, Sarah, when you were talking about the science passion projects. And I was wondering, how do you scaffold your students so that all students are engaged? The reason why I ask is because at Newlands we are trying to implement kind of a passion project system, and I won't get into that, but there are some students that really find it hard to have not initiative, but they're just stuck and they don't know where to begin and they can't think of any ideas, and then it kind of so any information you could give in terms of how you set it up to be successful in your teaching would be fantastic.
Okay. So I guess as coach, my important role that I play is for some students, they do need that opportunity to tease out things they care about, things they're interested in. The letterbox, which if you could automate it, it would be amazing. Like plastic straws, or dental floss, what if I could get some harakiki and figure out how I could turn that into, what matters to them? And so my role is to engage with them, to provide them opportunities to peer challenge each other and try and tease those out. So there's no, for some of our kids, they need time, and often schools don't lend that themselves well to giving kids time. And how do you, it's like you don't want to force something out of them. So maybe there's something that they could engage with another student, because that learning is still going to take place. They might not have given birth to the idea. So it's just trying to figure out how do you give time to it? What my role is to help them think about things that are right in front of them. They can't see it. How can you allow students to support each other's learning, because it's not a race, so learning will still take place. You'll still have kids that really struggle through the process, but that in itself is still a valuable way. I guess I would feel challenged if they were not engaged in the way I said with the crossword. Like, you can still, really relish a crossword that's a little bit too hard, but if it's pitched so that they don't know any words, then that disengagement occurs, then I'm not doing my job in terms of trying to help them navigate that. Does anyone else want to add?
Yeah, one of the things I like when we do student projects at school, and each year group, we devote normally about 4 to 5 weeks of doing a student project. So our equivalent to your year 8, we start off, so it's very much teacher directed, and up until years would be 10 and 11, then it's more student centred, that they pick their passion type thing, which they will do. But part of that, we also make sure that the teacher actually sits down with the student right at the beginning and goes through, what are you thinking about? What data are you going to collect? What equipment do you need? Just to ask those questions, because my kids, when they did science experiments at home, Dad was there to help, but for a lot of kids, they don't have that help at home. So it's a good time that teachers can actually sit down individually with kids and go through and give them a hand and say, hey, look, this is great. And they get terrific projects.
Can I just add one more little helpful thing maybe, is we engage, for example, an investigative process. They don't go in cold, so they've been built up to this point. So a lot of things that the kids enjoy is, in terms of technology, is that first cut thinking. That dream phase where they just brain dump and they just get careless with trying to design new things. So they've done a science investigation that might be quite simplistic in nature, but they've done it together, and then trying to understand why it is that someone else got different data or anomalies, or why they made decisions that they did. So that building up to that point is something also that is about building that relationship for learning in there as well.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, we've got two people.
Hi. So I'm a postgrad student at Victoria University. I'm studying the Master of Science in Society, so a brand new postgrad program. So I think it's been quite well established today that science education is very important in preparing our future generations to understand and react to contemporary scientific issues like climate change, nanotechnology, GMOs. What would you make of the thought or the idea that good science education is also an important part of democracy, particularly with regards to voting on and helping to shape evidence-based policy?
Yep, I'm absolutely with you on that one. There's science for citizenship, obviously. Then there is a huge number of participatory science opportunities in New Zealand. We've just had some big workshops going on in Wellington where everybody was getting together and these big moves to try and join the dots a little more in terms of all of that participatory science. And then there's also civics, which is different from citizenship. And then civics is where you are looking at how our country is governed and what your role is in it, and that you do have not just a role and an opportunity but a responsibility. So you're right, with things like climate change, it's very easy when you're teaching for it to feel disabling for students because it's such a big problem, and the feeling of futility that we sometimes end up giving those youngsters when we deal with something that is so big and so gnarly, and we're such a little country and all of that. That's a challenge for teaching, and we have to have that right in our minds as we're working, so that the ability for the individual to have efficacy is recognised. We also need to challenge them. We need to challenge them to register to vote. It was pretty appalling in previous elections how few of our young people voted, and yet when they turned out to vote, look what happened, sort of thing. That's exciting, and I think we need to be able to model that within our own school systems, within our own hierarchies, that the student council has a voice, and right down into our classroom where the students feel that efficacy, that agency within their own learning, and that will translate itself up with the scientific knowledge on board. Then they will become civically active and responsible. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but I'm right with you, and the importance of communication in that space is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, look, I think it's extremely important that there's certain things that the population needs to know. And, vaccinations over in Australia, I don't know what it's like in New Zealand, but we have a problem because not everybody vaccinates their kids. And we've tried lots and lots of things. And that's because Andrew Wakefield, back in the 1998, wrote a paper that said that there was a link between the vaccines for measles and so forth with autism. Now, that was an absolute fraud, but certain people get on the media and they say, there may be a link. I'm just not convinced. But the one thing is, we're just so close to get rid of measles. Polio, we've almost got rid of it. And smallpox, we got rid of that in the 1960s. And you think, how many millions of people have been able to survive because of that? But we've still got people that do not vaccinate their kids, and it's going to cause a problem for everybody else. So that's our moral responsibility. And the same with climate change. And we've got to make sure we in fact, I was told by a principal once that we actually have to teach both sides of the arguments for climate change. And I thought, but the other argument isn't scientific. It's all wishy-washy.
Yeah.
But so we've got a massive thing that we have to do as science educators.
Okay, we've got time for two more questions, or three. We've got three here. We have to be quite quick in our answers, panel. But the very good news is they will be with you during morning tea and you can corner them. Okay, so we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm at Victoria University. I work for the Faculty of Science, and I sit on that, and Teri knows exactly what I'm talking about. I sit on that kind of gulf between tertiary and secondary. And when we're talking about, encouraging future scientists and encouraging them to pursue passions into tertiary study and later into careers, the relationship between tertiary and secondary is, at least in my experience, disjointed and usually down to individuals. And so what I'm kind of curious about is, what do you think the ideal relationship should be between science at a tertiary level, not necessarily university, but in your other institutions, and secondary school, secondary? What is the ideal relationship there?
Okay, Sarah, we're going to give that one to you.
Sorry.
No.
Oh, gosh.
What's your ideal relationship?
I don't know. It's tricky because when I think about... So I'm operating in the Kahui Ako space right now as well. And in terms of that transitioning and care, as our young people move through their education, I guess it's tricky when secondary schools are telling primary schools what they need to do, because somehow they need to do this in order for us to do this. And so I guess the frustrations can be equally so between, tertiary and secondary. I don't know. I guess that's my only thinking around what are we doing to support those transitions for our students so that we make that as seamless as possible and respect the needs of the learner as they transition in terms of learning and the gatekeeping that can happen at that. Does anyone else want to add to that? That didn't really answer your question, but that's my thinking.
Quick, Teri, a quick word.
You know where I stand on this, actually, Tom, don't you? I think we have inherited a really clunky structure where that disjoin between the tertiary and the secondary, where the tertiary is telling us, is forcing the secondary to stay in their silos because of this thing called UE, and I will name it. And that has prevented a lot of really good science going on in the secondary. In turn, with the way that science is taught in the secondary, there are some really valuable skills and attitudes and ways of thinking that are not being recognised by the tertiary. So there's just this incredibly fertile space in there where if we could both let go of a little bit of what is precious to us, that I think with the coming changes in education, we have the potential to make that a lot more streamlined, to get more of those lecturers into secondary classrooms to see how the teaching and learning happens so that they can build on it, and vice versa, to have universities open up more to those schools so that they can be coming in and streamlining for students. Not only that, but I'm just going to do a plug for the NCA review. Look at big opportunity number 3, which is building pathways at level 2 and 3 so that those who do go on to university, and it's not everybody, gets a chance to do a taster and to do that exploration before they get there so that they don't have to spend their first year trying to find their way around the university.
And can I just be really controversial here? Can you put up your hand if you have not gone to university? Okay. Okay. So, now, can I just say, my children, they did not go to university. And the one thing, this is a problem I see in New South Wales schools is every teacher went to university, so every teacher has this idea that students, a measure of success is to get to university. Well, I tell you, it's not. You can actually get a trade, you can go to university in future, years and years later if you want to, but it's not the end all thing that you have to aspire to. And so when it comes to talking about what we should do for high school to university, well, what we would like is for universities to be involved, but the one thing is not every kid wants to go to university. And the other thing is if we did what we want, then it would be very labour intensive for the universities.
But every student does need to be able to interact scientifically with their world, don't they? So you're right. Yeah. We're teaching the basics of science without the if you like, the sacred cow of being able to necessarily transition into a traditional university.
So I'm going to bring to end this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for you being here and for this opportunity. If you could just show your appreciation.